It's hard.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom, Torah study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman. Marc, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, my dear.
We are in the middle of the book of Exodus, and smack in the middle of the book of Exodus, between the great story of the Exodus from Egypt and the building of the tabernacle, which is what's coming next in Shemot, are these two parshiot, Yitro and Mishpatim, which talk about our experience standing at Mount Sinai. According to the ancient tradition, every Jew who ever lived was standing at Mount Sinai. Marc, I hope that you were close by, and I apologize if I stepped on your foot.
I was looking for a snow cone.
Yeah, I remember that. And because we all heard these voices, we all saw this panoply of remarkable experiences. We all experienced revelation. Revelation is incumbent upon all of us. It is imperative upon all of us. And so in this week's Torah portion, we are given a catalog of law. It is an entire catalog of law. It doesn't have a particular structure or order the way that you would assume a legal code would do, but it deals with all sorts of issues within the interpersonal relations of human beings and all sorts of relations between Jews and non-Jews, all sorts of relations with the world. What's remarkable here is that this is where faith comes and touches the world. This is where faith touches the world. It is one thing to say I'm a believer. It is one thing to say I have deep spirituality. The Torah says that's great. That's not what we want, or not only what we want, rather. What we want is a certain quality of ethical behavior, a certain quality of religious behavior in the course of your daily life. A very beautiful story about the grandfather of the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was known as the Ohev Yisrael. They brought him a guy, they introduced him to a fellow. They said, oh, he's such a Shomer Shabbos. He is such a pious Jew on the Sabbath. And the Ohev Yisrael, the rabbi, looked back and said, yeah, but is he a Shomer Chol? Does his spirituality, does his Sabbath observance, does the quality of his soul carry into the rough and tumble interactions of daily life? Does it change the way he does business, the way he spends money, the way he treats his family, the way he treats his employees? Does it have an effect on the Judaism of the street? And that's what this Torah portion is all about. It is a Torah portion almost entirely devoted to the Judaism of the street. And much of it, I want to admit this at the outset, is political, because you can't deal with the street without getting into questions of power and money. And questions of power and money deal with, well, the street. And they're questions where values collide with each other. That's what makes them controversial. And when values collide, we take sides, we argue our positions, and Torah then has something to say about this interaction. I want to begin, however, with a section which is not political, but deeply ethical. It's actually the kind of Jewish law that all of us learned when we were kids. This is the law you teach the little kids. It's lost and found law. The question is, if you find something that somebody has lost, are you obligated to give it back? All right? If you're shopping at Trader Joe's and you see oranges all over the parking lot, you pick them up, or do you have to bring them back? If you see a purse full of money, do you have to bring it back? You remember there was a wonderful radio show called Car Talk, Ray and Tom Maliazzi on PBS. Yes. So a caller once called in with this question. He bought a used Cadillac from a guy, paid a reasonable price for it. A few years after he bought it, he got a flat tire. He opened the trunk and for the first time took out the spare tire. And there underneath the spare tire was a brown paper bag filled with $100 bills. And he's calling Ray and Tom Maliazzi, the car talk guys, and asking them, does he have to give it back? So the first question was like, who'd you buy the car from? Does he have to give it back? Well, this is the great question that the Bible is going to direct us to, and it's a great question that Talmud is going to ask. So let's take a look. I'm going to put up here on the screen some texts. I hope that you can follow this with me. When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, this is from Exodus 23, you must take it back to him. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it. So if you see the animal that belongs to not even your friend, the animal that belongs to someone that you can't stand, you are obligated to bring it back. Then in Deuteronomy, the same law is repeated with a little more detail. If you see your fellow's ox, so here it's a fellow, not your enemy, or sheep going astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you don't know who he is, very frequently an animal doesn't have an identifying mark, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment. You shall do the same with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. You must not stand idly by. If you see your fellow's ass fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help him to raise it. Now, before we get into the details of the law, let's just note something very important, because this is one of the areas where Jewish law and American law are very different. American law is based on the English liberal philosophical tradition, which imagines that each of us is born into the world as a free, independent, autonomous individual, and that we enter into relationships in order to accomplish things we can't accomplish individually, like building civilizations and having families. But when we enter into those relationships, we give up our freedom. And the great question, and law is an expression of the freedom we give up in order to observe the rights of other people. So I would love to drive 75 miles an hour down the street, but I don't want to hurt anybody, and I don't want anybody else doing that and hurting me. So I give up my liberty to drive 75 miles an hour down the street in order to assure a safe street environment. And in that environment where we are seen as an individual and we are given liberties, then you can't have a law that says you have to return a lost object. Because I found it, it's mine, it's finders keepers. I found it, and you can't obligate me to do something beyond my own interests in this case. Now, morally, I might be obligated, but legally, I'm not. Jewish law looks at it differently. Jewish law does not see us as individuals, but as members embedded within a community, in a circle of relationship. And therefore, Jewish law talks about obligation, not rights, and talks about obligations, not liberties, and talks about obligations for the purpose of making us better people, in addition to giving us a society that's livable. So just as a classic example, before we get back to lost and found, in American law, you're not obligated to give charity. It's your own business. You want to give charity, you give charity. But nobody obligates you to give charity. You can get a tax deduction for it, so there's an incentive, but that's not an obligation. In Jewish law, you're obligated to give charity because you're part of a community. The community needs the charity, and you need, as a human being, to grow into a charitable person. Here, too, in American law, if you find a wallet, you're not obligated to give it back. In Jewish law, you are obligated to give it back because that's the kind of person the community wants you to become. Now, when I talk to this to little kids, we have a lot of fun. You find an animal, You don't know who it belongs to. You bring it home. What could happen? And that's Talmud now. That's how the Talmud begins to think. What could happen? Well, what if the animal gets sick? Do you have to call a doctor? How much food do you have to give the animal? Animals eat a lot. What if the animal makes a mess on your carpet? Who's responsible for that? What if the animal is mazel tov, pregnant, and gives birth to a little animal? Who owns the little animal? You or the person who lost the animal? How do you know if somebody shows up at your front door and says, Gellman, that's my sheep? And you say, well, identify it. And I say, it's woolly, and goes, bah. Do I have to give it back to that guy? These are all the questions that the Talmud begins to expand upon as it asks the question, when do I have to give stuff back and when don't I? Marc, you ready?
Yeah.
Do I have to give stuff back? So now the Talmud jumps in. So let's take a look now at the Talmud. The Talmud is the code of Jewish law of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. And the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, the name of the chapter is Elu Metziot. These are the things that somebody found. Which are the items that belong to the finder, and which are the items that you have to proclaim? You have to put up posters in the neighborhood saying, hey, I found this. Has anybody lost it? So given the obligation to return a lost object, which of the objects can I keep? And which are the objects that I have to make extra special efforts to go find the person who lost them? So these belong to the finder. If he found pieces of fruit scattered about, coins scattered about, sheaves, cakes of figs, baker's loaves, string, all this different stuff. Now you can see why, right? These are his. These are his. Because, and the question is why? Why, if you come to the Trader Joe's parking lot and see oranges all over the place, can you keep them? Right? Rabbi Yehuda says anything which has an unusual trait, he has to proclaim, right? So, for example, if he found a fig cake, if he found a cake of figs, and it had a potsherd or a coin in it, or something that identified it, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, if he found something new, right, then and lacking a mark of identification, he doesn't have to proclaim it. Which are the things that he has to proclaim? If he found pieces of fruit in a utensil, a purse filled with coins, piles of fruit, piles, not just scattered about, piles of coins. Now, what's the difference? The difference is you have to go through the following mental process. Ready? If I were the loser, would I come back and look for them? So if I get home from Trader Joe's and notice a hole in the bottom of my bag and all my oranges are gone, am I likely to say, oh my God, I'm going to run back to Trader Joe's and look for them? Or am I liable to say, I'll never get them back? The moment I would think that somebody would say, I'll never get them back, that's when they belong to the finder. But if it's anything that might make the person say, well, I would imagine coins in a purse, someone's going to go back and look for them because they're identifiable. Because if I were the loser, I would go looking for them. And so the whole idea here is, how would I think if I were in that position? That's called an ethic of empathy. And that's what lost and found law in Jewish law is all about. It's not really about returning stuff. It's really about cultivating in us a way of asking, what would it feel like to be the other? What would it feel like to be in that position? And cultivating the capacity, the moral and imaginative capacity to engender an ethic of empathy. Marc, you return lost objects?
Yeah, and there's another element to this that I'm sure you were about to get to, which is one of the reasons we have to give him back, is that Judaism does not have a concept of private property. That's one of the things we got from the English, which is We own what we own. It's ours. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Mine, mine, mine. We are individual autonomous creatures, as you said, and we have rights, which are basically barriers that prevent other people from coming in and taking advantage of us or doing anything that we don't allow inside our little white picket fence. But Judaism believes God owns everything. Kol haaretz li. The whole earth is mine. And so what we're really doing is we're just trading and manipulating stuff God owns. So it's not like we own it and we found it, it's ours. It's never ours. And you can trace that back to our attitude that you did mention about charity. The word for charity comes from caritas, which means caring, loving, caring. It's in philosophy, we call it a supererogatory act. Very big word, which means above and beyond the call of duty. So that if you give it, it's fine, but you're not obligated to do it. In Judaism, charity is called tzedakah, which means basically justice, righteousness. So it has nothing to do with what you want. It has to do with what you must do, what you're obligated to do in order to create a just society. And that is distribute wealth more equitably. And one of the ways you distribute wealth equitably is you return stuff and you don't hoard stuff. And another way is you don't take advantage of others. And you don't use your observance of Jewish law to profit. The great English metal trading company, Beer Sondheimer, they, during World War I, built their fortune they had a huge store of copper ore and copper ingots, which as World War I broke out, were needed for bullets and bombs. And so the War Department, in a famous story, sent messages, telegrams to the Beer, the head of it, and came on Saturday. And he was Shomer Shabbos. So he didn't open any of the telegrams. And each telegram offered him more and more and more for the copper. And at the end of Shabbos, he called up the War Department and he said, I accept your first offer because I can't profit from the fact that I observed Shabbos. And because of the trust that was developed and the honesty that was developed by this Jewish merchant, the War Department used him exclusively to contract for their metal needs. And when you think of all the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews stealing money and being crafty, the truth is so much, it's not just that that's a terrible canard, it's that the truth was exactly the opposite. The Jews were, in general, gracious, honest, compassionate, and true to their word. One of the reasons why Jews were, for example, prominent in the trade of condensed wine. In the Middle Ages, all the wine that was swallowed in all the castles of Europe was not regular wine. It was, wherever it was grown and processed in Italy or wherever, it was where you'd have the wine, that they would take up too much room in the casks. So what they would do is reduce by some mechanism of processing, maybe boiling, they would reduce the volume of the wine into smaller casks and ship them. And they would put their name on the outside of the cask. Well, one of the problems is they come into the place you want to sell them in London, and people look at them and they say, well, how do I know it's any good? And you can't open it, because if you open the cask, it's yours. So what they would do is they would look at the sign on it. And the Jewish sign, they would look for the Jewish sign because they trusted Jewish companies. They trusted the name of the shipper. And that's another example of the uprightness of Jewish financial dealing. And what you said at the beginning and the setup for this is so wonderful and true. You know, Judaism in the Torah that we study every week, it doesn't really have beliefs. Now, these last two Parshiot are as close as we get. But particularly in Mishpatim, we don't have a creed. There is no Nicene creed in Judaism. We believe in this, this, and this. Maimonides wanted that, but it just didn't exist. Because for Christians, creeds were necessary to determine who was a Christian. If you don't believe in item number 4, you weren't Christian, you had to form a new branch. But Judaism never had creeds, but we have law. We have law, not creeds. And Mishpatim is the way we understand our relationship with each other. Now, of course, each law has a set of beliefs that undergird it. The reason I've gone on and on about this business of returning is that that's our belief. It's the foundation of all these laws is that we don't own anything. We're just holding it for God and trying to make a good disposition of what we own, what we have, not what we own. And in fact, this carried on to the temple. One of the gates of the temple, there were gates for women, there were gates for priests, there were 7 different gates. One of the 7 gates was the gate of lost objects. You go in that gate if you lost something in the previous year or whatever, and people would have stuff they found. And then they could return it to the original owner. So we are the inventors of the lost and found. And the temple was a gigantic, exuberant, very fancy, very high-end lost and found office. And I'm very proud to be a part of a faith that requires you to go nuts to find a way to return something to somebody because of what it shows about our underlying values.
So let's push this one more level up for a second. My Orthodox cousins observe Jewish law as it's expressed first in the Talmud, then in the Shulchan Aruch, and then in the Mishnah Brura, and they observe it to the letter. Very, very careful about observing Jewish law. Sometimes to their detriment. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it's even painful. And my cousin, we've had talks about this. He'll say even sometimes it's against his own ethics, but he believes that these are godly laws and we must observe them. Okay. I went to JTS, and conservative Judaism holds to Jewish law. We believe that Jewish law changes over the generations. And so there is a dynamic of change within Jewish law. When I was a seminary student and then a young rabbi, the principal change was welcoming women onto the bima, allowing women to have a bat mitzvah, letting women read from the Torah, lead prayer, and eventually the ordination of women as rabbis. Much later, they came to the idea that friends who are gay and lesbian should be, and gender fluid, should be able to serve as rabbis as well. These are major changes in Jewish law, but the basic structure of a legal system that is objective and that you have to keep those laws, that was there in my conservative ideology growing up and growing into the rabbinate. The Reform movement, where you were raised and trained, the Reform movement kept the ethical laws of Torah, but they gave away the ritual laws so that my Reform colleagues will make a personal decision about, say, kosher food, a personal decision about their Sabbath observance, a personal decision about the structure of prayer. The ritual laws of the tradition became an expression of personal spiritual autonomy. Did I get that right?
Yeah, except there's also been changes, sadly, in the ethical law too.
Mhm.
Once you start changing stuff, Eddie, you don't know exactly where to stop.
But you see, both positions have their flaws, right? The flaw of the conservative, or leave Orthodox aside because they're not here to talk about it. The flaw in the conservative movement's position is that the law changes so very slowly. And because it changes so very slowly, it often leaves us behind when we're looking for the ethical thing to do. Right now, for example, in the conservative movement, one of the issues that we deal with is what happens when someone wishes to marry for the second time and they don't have a get. A get is a Jewish divorce. Now, in Jewish law, a woman cannot remarry without a get, and a man can, because technically polygamy is allowed, and only a man can sue for divorce, a woman can't. And that causes a terrible imbalance. Even though we acknowledge egalitarianism in so many places, in conservative Jewish custom, practice, this is one of the places we have egalitarian ethics haven't reached. There are, we should say, other remedies to this, but they're not nearly as efficient as a get. And on the other hand, in the reform movement, if everything is open to personal autonomy, then how do you form a religious community of common practice and common ideology? Would that be a fair statement?
That's a fair description of it.
And this is the dilemma of Parshat Mishpatim, right? As you and I, as a conservative reform rabbi, read these things. So my teacher, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, and others like him, arrived at a different way of thinking about it, and that was what I tried to express in my opening comment about the Parsha. Rabbi Schulweis always asked me this question: what kind of person does this law shape? He used the phrase teleology. It's a great word to drop in conversation. It means, where's it getting me to?
Yeah, if you want the conversation to end.
No.
Throw in teleology.
Where's it getting me to? What's the process? It's a process. Where's it getting me to? And he would say, we ought to look for teleological halacha, meaning we ought to observe law, but we ought to be asking ourselves, what kind of person does this law shape? What kind of ethical human being does this law create? So the lost and found law that we just looked at, I'm going to suggest that the value of the lost and found law is not only the kind of social peace and social solidarity that we have when I know that my neighbor will return the lawnmower that he borrowed. I know that. But more than that, it's about creating a certain kind of human being, a human being who asks herself or himself, well, if I were the one who lost it, how would I be thinking today? Because it engenders that kind of empathy, that kind of moral imagination. It's a law that ought to be on the books because of its teleology.
Or
what do you think of teleological halacha, Marc?
Well, I agree, but I agree with it completely. But I would just frame it a different way. I'd say laws that are not morally justifiable need to die out, and they need to be excluded from our tradition. We can't forget, Ed, that in this parsha, it begins with a defense of slavery. Now it says the Eved Olam, the perpetual slave. You have to manumate slaves. You have to emancipate them after their 7 years of service. You cancel debts and let them go, but you don't have to let their children go, and that they had when you were there, they were with you. All of these things make no sense. And the problem is, what if the slave says, no, I'm happy here. I want to be your slave forever. And then you nail his ear to a door. It makes no sense. But whatever, he can still be your slave. Then he's your slave forever. I don't think any sacred scripture has room for a defense of slavery, however defined. And I think it has to be changed. On the other hand, in this Parsha, the wonderful description that you gave of the different sources of the return law, the Hashevoto law, you shall return it to him, is that it also has other implications the rabbis drew from it, which weren't intended, but showed the compassion of Judaism. Obviously, the slave laws did not show our compassion, but in fairness, Jews didn't own slaves because it was illegal in states that had them, nations. But I work in medical ethics, Jewish medical ethics. And so one of the issues in Jewish medical ethics that Christian fundamentalists also face is, are we violating God's will when we heal people? Because we believe illness is the result of sin. I don't believe that, but that's the teaching. You get sick because you did something wrong, and it's God's intention to punish you with illness. They didn't understand why you get sick, but that's how they understood illness. And therefore, if you heal them, are you not violating God's will? So that's the question. And so what they needed is a proof text from the Torah, where they would say, here it is. This is the proof that you can heal people. And they picked this week's Parsha, and they picked the phrase, V'hashevoto lo, you shall return it to him. So, what are you returning? You're returning a person's health. They lost their health, and you are obligated by that law to return their health to them. And how do you return their health? By medicine and medical procedures. And that was it. What it shows is not just how crafty they could be to find a law that had nothing to do with medical ethics and violated other ideas. It was a different thing that made me smile and proud. And that is, I'm proud that I'm with a tradition that found a way to find a text to justify saving lives. And I love that. I love the fact people always say, well, this law is bad, that law is bad. Yeah, some laws are bad. But one of the reasons I fall on the more conservative side of Reform Judaism is that they aren't all bad. And that some of the laws instill a kind of nobility in us and a ethical compassion in us that is extraordinary. Your topic of the year, Heschel's theology, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the story that David Novak told me about being in his class, and Heschel said he was teaching him about blood in an egg, how blood in an egg makes it treif. You can't eat an egg with a drop of blood in the yolk. And then he teaches them the laws. And at the end of the class, he says, gentlemen, you are now experts in tracking blood in an egg. I hope you will be just as good in seeing blood in money. So that was Heschel. And that's more than Heschel. That is the highest spirit of Jewish law, to use it to lift us up and to take the best of the laws, even if you're interpreting them against their plain meaning. You're using them to instill Jewish values in your life.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. So I would go one more step. So at the beginning of the Parsha, the beginning of the Torah portion, there's a discussion of the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave. And what it does is it limits the amount of time a person can serve as a slave. You're right. It's still slavery. It doesn't include non-Jewish slaves, which Jews
or the kids of slaves.
Or the kids of slaves. But that one little law that you mentioned, I think it still has value, even just to learn it. And sometimes there are things in the Bible which are worth learning, even if we find the moral context of the whole discussion difficult. but that particular one. So the law basically is that a person sells himself into slavery in order to pay a debt. It's an indentured servitude. And the longest that he can serve is 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, he goes free. And then the Bible asks this question: what if he doesn't want to go free?
Right.
What if he wants to remain a slave? Now, that question is such an interesting question. I mean, of all of the problems in that particular system that one could point out, right? What if he wants to stay a slave? Now, think about the problem here. Why would someone want to stay a slave? What kind of human personality would give up his personal freedom and autonomy, his personal dignity, in order to remain a slave? Well, it's a person who values the security of having a master. It's a person who values the security of knowing that every tomorrow is going to look just like every yesterday. It's a person who has relinquished a critical element of his humanity in order to say, I want to stay a slave. I want a master to tell me how to live my life. I don't want to be free. And the punishment, there's only 2 places in the entire Hebrew Bible where someone is maimed as a punishment. And this is one of them. You take the guy to the doorpost and you take an awl, a sharp object, and you whack a hole in his ear, right? I think that's why certain people have earrings, but that's a whole nother. And he remains a slave forever. There's a long midrash about why the door. Why the door? Because he refused to step out of the door. Because outside the doorway is insecure. Outside the doorway in the world of freedom, he can't control the conditions of existence. He wants to remain inside. And why the ear? Because he didn't hear God's word saying, now you're free. But the idea that a human being would accept slavery because freedom is too frightening raises such an interesting question. In how many ways do we accept slavery because freedom is too frightening? Just the idea, just the question is such a powerful sort of meditation, and raises what kind of human being are we creating in the world we live? That's such an interesting kind of question. All right, Gellman, I'm going to give you God's power for a moment. I know that you cherish this. Give me a new law. Eila Mishpatim. These are the laws that Moses brought down from Sinai. Gellman, I'm going to give you the chance to bring down a law from Sinai. What's a new law that ought to be brought down to us now?
Well, I would say, as your new lawgiver, that the only law that you need, the only law that matters, is be kind. There's no specific law that urges us specifically in Judaism to be kind. And that I believe, with all the good parts of feeling that we have duties and not rights, which you explained wonderfully, there is one limitation in that. And that is caritas, this Christian idea of just doing something specifically just to be kind. Now, there is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But it's not exactly clear, and it isn't specified. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? So I would specify the law and just be kind. I think the entire medical profession has been able to orient itself on one single star in the heavens, in the ethical heavens, and that's the Hippocratic Oath, which begins primum non malere. The first thing is this: do no harm. Do no harm, which is as good a definition of what it what I mean by be kind. I would say if God came back and edited the Torah, and I would want to have a few words with God about lobsters and shrimps. I'm not kidding you.
And slavery, yeah.
That's slavery. Those need to be discussed. They can be done after the session is over. But I would say I want a God who comes back and tells us, just be kind and do no harm. And I think if you follow that, more or less everything else falls into place.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I like that a lot. That's a good one. On Yom Kippur, I gave a sermon based on an idea that came to me as I was, studying for the holiday. That when we were little kids, we all learned the words to Shema Yisrael, but we always look at the end of it, Adonai Echad, as the most important part. And I suggested that maybe that's not the most important part. Maybe the most important is the first two words, Shema Yisrael, and that's actually a mitzvah. The mitzvah is to learn to listen, which means to learn to quiet the ego, to quiet the self, to be open to hear the voice of the other, to be open to hear the voice of the world, to be open to hear your own voice, your own conscience voice, and to truly, truly absorb that voice and to listen. And if I were adding another law, a 600 and somethingth commandment, I think I would count Shema Yisrael as one of the commandments. Thank you, Marc. I want to wish you a good Shabbos. And to everyone who's listening today, thank you for listening. Shema Yisrael, a very, very good Shabbos. Service from Valley Beth Shalom follows on YouTube, of course, this morning. And wishing you all a very, very wonderful, quiet, peaceful Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom, my friends.